Hi, folks. Welcome to another edition of Flow Engineering Live. Um, I think I'm going to have Andrew here momentarily, but just to introduce our topic of the day, we had amazing feedback from Miguel Diaz on when we launched this session. We put this up onto uh, LinkedIn for comment. We had his wonderful input on a couple of questions. So we're going to go through them. And, I think this is really exciting. We don't typically have, you know, questions from the public, from folks who are learning about flow engineering. So it's wonderful to have that and be able to address what's on your minds. So feel free to jump on our next session, which has been scheduled already, I believe. I think we've got the next couple up on LinkedIn. So jump into the comments, ask us whatever you want to know, and we will do our best. So, hey, Andrew, welcome.
Hey, nice to see you, sir.
So let's dive right in because we like to keep this super rapid fire. I'm going to toss on the first question. Miguel asks, when applying flow engineering, do you usually work with representatives from 1 to 2 teams or 4 to 6 teams? Andrew, have you found any kind of commonality in terms of how many separate disciplines or areas of a company are participating and what makes a good mix?
There's a tension, obviously, between wanting to have comprehensive representation from everybody who's involved in the whole process, and then not having too many people in the meeting. If you've got too many people in the meeting, first of all, it becomes unwieldy. Second of all, most of the folks will just get disengaged. And so if you have a relatively smaller, tighter crew, then you increase the chances of engagement. So the last exercise we did like this was about increasing the release frequency of our own products at AutoRabbit, and it's a pretty diverse group that's involved in a release. So we've got development leads and architecture team and QA team and security team and the product team, and so just there I listed 5 groups. So I think it's if the process can be scoped down to just include 1 to 2 teams, then great. It can be a little bit more coherent and small, but there's a tension in a lot of these things, and that's where the intuition and judgment comes in.
Yeah, that's great. That kind of mirrors my own experience, and I think that I'm thinking of a recent case. Last week, actually, did mapping, and the organization has kind of like a what they call a runway process. So they have early shaping and planning that kind of then gets handed down to these teams that go and build. And that's a very long process. In entirety, it's a very long process with many, many more groups than I would say 4 to 6. And so, and they kind of don't really speak the same language. They don't have the same metrics. They don't really consider themselves a unified flow. And so to kind of look at the current state, what we did was separate that, the early stages from the delivery or the development and delivery. And that helped us kind of manage that scope. But there was an interesting case where we actually had 2 different teams running similar processes, but they were different enough that we didn't want to mash them together. So sometimes we're talking about horizontal variety in terms of stakeholders, but then there's almost vertical variety in some cases where a client will want to get a bunch of different teams together that do the same thing, but they each do it differently. And we actually had them run mapping in parallel on their own. We basically tried to guide the process of them building out their own value stream maps. And then we kind of compared and contrasted them. And it went extremely well. They had kind of direct build ability right on the board. And it was really engaging and really informative and saved time, frankly. We collapsed two mapping sessions into one. I would say not ideal, but I was pleasantly surprised by how well it went.
And did they come away with a unified process?
Well, we highlighted the variety or the variation. Yeah.
Right.
So we didn't get into future state mapping. It was really just current state, but it was very easy to see where there were those differences. And it was a very interesting conversation because that was all visible in real time and people could sort of see that and we could talk about it in that session rather than sort of going away. And I think, if you take a map and you go and show it to another group when you weren't really part of it being built, there's something lost there. There's something foreign about that might be interesting, but maybe not to the same degree. So it was an interesting variation that I didn't think would work as well as it did, and it really surprised me.
Fantastic. And there's another one of those tensions, is this tension between standardization across a company versus giving each team autonomy. There really are significant benefits to standardization. It's not necessarily the case that it's just somebody on high saying this is the way everybody shall do things, and that's of course where it becomes too rigid and limiting. But the ease of people being able to move from one team to another, applying common tooling, sharing ideas between the different teams is critical. And I think having a standard process, but accommodating the variation is feels to be the right balance.
This leads us right into our next question. Well done. So Miguel also asked, when conducting an outcome mapping session, how do we balance sticking to the plan with letting discussion flow or asking more questions? And I think that plays on this idea of the spectrum from prescriptive to generative, right? Where we're like, let's run through the process as it is, be very strict with timing, time boxing, let's say. And then letting things kind of wander and generate or like emerge, right, is the word that I kind of think of. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is facilitation really being an art and a science, right? That we're kind of like leveraging the science of things like Parkinson's law, insofar as they can be considered science, but these kind of like observable technical practices, let's say, and space making, right, and enabling conversation and saying, yes, but like, let's not get carried away. I don't know. Have you found any kind of techniques that you keep in mind, or that you, things that inform your balancing when you're facilitating?
I mean, I do think time boxing as a practice is just exquisitely powerful, and it happens. It happens whether you like it or not. The day ends up getting time boxed. Your energy ends up running out, and so we're living in all these time boxes anyway. And so creating these artificial time boxes to say, hey, we've got 1 hour. We need to come up with a clear idea of what is the outcome that we want. I think often what's lacking is people, if they've not done the exercise before, they don't quite know what it is that we're getting at, or they get a vague sense, but they assume maybe that we're actually trying to do a project plan or something like that. Right. And so I think one thing that can take up extra time is having to explain and then re-explain and then re-explain what is the outcome of the outcome mapping session, for example, like what is the goal? And so some of that is the startup cost as you get a group familiar with some of these things, and that can get cheaper and easier the second time you do it, the third time you do it. But I do think the generative aspect is all of these things are meant to be free form and free flowing, but within these tight constraints. Like, you need to know what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And so you as a facilitator certainly have to be clear coming in the outcome of what is the purpose of the outcome mapping session. Understand what is the key or are the key goals that we want to accomplish through any process improvement. And reminders are helpful. You'll be needing
Mm.
to remind the group as they go through that, because folks will get distracted because there's an infinite variety of rabbit holes attached to these things. So I think sticking to the plan is the facilitator's role is mostly to keep everybody sticking to the plan, knowing that the
Mhm.
plan itself allows for plenty of discursive wandering.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that comes to mind for me about that is that the constraints are enabling as much as they are governing. Like that restriction and being very specific about it. Here's what we're trying to do in the next 5 minutes. And we have 5 minutes to do it, and everybody needs to, be helping to push the ball up the hill uh, over this time is very helpful because I think it can clarify, but also it kind of urges you to go with the first thing that comes to mind. Like instead of overthinking and instead of getting caught in, maybe hanging back and listening uh, when you could be participating, that level of urgency kind of drives you to go with the first thought. And then you can kind of reinforce that as a facilitator, say, great, like that thing that you thought was risky is actually incredibly valuable, and it's helping us. And you can kind of urge that, say what comes to mind, put it on the board, let's get stuff out. We can always distill afterwards. And but that I think the pressure of the time box is extremely helpful if you're supporting that contribution, right? It can be intimidating, I'm sure, to be looking at that ticking clock. But I think it does forge really good results. And I had an interesting like little case last week where I ran 6 workshops with one company, 6 different teams sequentially, and every single time I kind of got closer and closer to, because we would go overtime or we wouldn't get as far as we wanted. By the end of the week, everything was time boxed, everything was heavily facilitated. Expectations for every block of time were very clear, and it just made a world of difference. I kind of sometimes will go into a new client or a new environment, and I myself as a facilitator kind of hang back and see like what's the culture here, how do things go, like let's make some space for things. And then once you get a handle on it and you're like, well, this, I think we could be going further, I think we could be more productive, I think we could be pushing on the things that are emerging to help them, to coax them out, for instance. And so by the end of the week, I'd had everything kind of blocked very, very strictly, and it really made a massive difference. So I highly recommend that. We've got how much of an understanding of the context and problems of the teams do you usually get before going from interviews or outcome mapping to value stream mapping and dependency mapping? So how much context is expected from those early stages before you get into value stream mapping and dependency mapping?
And this feels like, especially, there's a question for facilitators if you're coming in as an outside facilitator as opposed to if you're already embedded in the team. And so that's, I think, one of the tricks with being a consultant of any kind, or facilitator for these workshops, certainly, is you come in with very little knowledge up front. And so the techniques, but you have to leave it to the team. And so I think at some point you have to just content yourself that it's up to the team. Your job is to set the boundaries, be a bit of a referee, and define the game, define the rules of the game, the rules of engagement, and then leave it to the team to fill in the details. Obviously, the more familiar you become, if you're embedded in this team on an ongoing basis, you can become more of a contributor. But I think there's a benefit to the. I mean, it's argued it's a feature or a bug, right? But the idea of a facilitator who's relatively naive about the process, the details, is powerful because they can ask very basic questions. They can ask the dumb questions that people in the team would be reluctant to ask, and sometimes surface. assumptions that the team has been operating on, or things that they themselves are not able to explain very well. Whereas a facilitator who's very familiar with the process, they'll have a much stronger temptation to talk more than take more than their fair share of time talking and control the process.
Yeah, you definitely, I think, you can get attached to the output and the outcome in such a way that you end up, nudging. And it can be difficult to kind of mitigate that urge to get folks where they need to get to, especially when, you're talking about we need to zero in, we need to focus, we need to ignore a bunch of things that could be distractions. And I think that that is a tempting and dangerous trap for facilitators, because what you're kind of tasked with doing is accepting what all of these participants think is important, not just what the organization is trying to achieve or what your understanding of value and direction and target outcome is. When you're giving examples, that's framing. So when you're trying to explain, here's the difference between an output and an outcome, for instance, using examples is very helpful, but those examples are going to frame an understanding, and in some cases redirect somebody from thinking about something as an outcome to your depiction of an outcome or the framing that you're using. So I think it is somewhat complicated and complex. It's certainly, I would say, complex work. And but in terms of how much understanding do you usually get, there's certainly, I'm thinking about this in terms of requirements. Like, what do you need before you can progress to value stream mapping and dependency mapping? I think you certainly need a clear understanding of what are we trying to achieve in terms of a change, right? The change is increased performance. And what does that mean? Is that throughput? Is that increased quality? Is there, margins involved or cost? And that really helps you kind of step into those later stages with, a task that's more narrow than boiling the ocean or trying to understand all the factors involved in what performance means or what the target outcome is trying to achieve. So I think it's necessary to get clarity and then to relay that back to the working group and say, here's my understanding. And that can be, sometimes you're taking a step beyond what they generated to try and say, here's what I think our target outcome is, from my understanding, looking at all these pieces that we weren't maybe easily able to assemble into something clear. Here's how I think that looks from my perspective. And I think that's fair because, as a facilitator, you will have more experience with this, certainly even just from an awareness perspective, than a lot of folks doing these sessions. So I don't think it's, as much as we don't want to lead the witness, I think it's very valuable in some cases to present, here's what I think good looks like, and then validate that.
And also again, the feature versus bug thing, the lack of familiarity that the facilitator has with the process means that they're hanging on all of the bits of knowledge that they do get. So if the team is very, very clear in outcome mapping about this is the improvement we're striving to make, but then by the time you get to value stream mapping, it's reminded them of all of these other things and all of these other ideas they might want to improve or optimize around. So it's very easy for the whole team to take the later stages of the process off in a very different direction. And so the facilitator, the virtue of their limited knowledge, they can bring everybody's attention back to, hey, I thought you said that this was the first primary goal that you're really trying to work towards here. How does the improvement that you lined out impact that? And if it doesn't,
Mhm.
Maybe do we need to take another look?
Yeah, and that is delicate work. You're bringing you're bringing an understanding back to someone as sort of like constructive feedback, right? You're sort of like relaying it back to them and saying, well, this is what you said before, and you're saying this now, and there's a discrepancy between the two. And you don't want to frame it in that context, but that's essentially what you're doing, is uh, trying to bridge the gap between those things, reconcile the difference in a way that they don't say, well, now I want this, right? I was talking about that, but now I know more, or, I don't really like the way that this is going. And I want to make sure that this thing gets addressed. Um, I'm thinking about another one of these workshops that I ran recently, which was a bunch of different middle management leaders who, were tasked with um, focusing on a target outcome during outcome mapping. But, they weren't really on the same team. They were in the same division, and they were distanced enough from senior leadership that there was something of a conflict between the target, the ultimate or overall target of improved performance, for instance, but then all of their local concerns had to be reconciled with that, right? This accumulation of technical debt, refactoring the platform, um, hiring concerns, um, management, like how do we organize people and talent. And so that was, this kind of leads me into the next question, which is a great one on top of this. Um, but, it was very tempting to go off in these different directions and be, well, let's talk about, because all these things are part of ultimately achieving the target outcome, right? You might have to address technical debt. You might have to go look at this specific issue of quality. But ultimately, if we fixate on any of those, then we might lose sight of the thing that's actually motivating the effort, right? What is the thing that the senior leadership will buy into, authorize, budget for, space for? They don't necessarily care about technical debt, at least not in those terms, not in the terms that matter to these stakeholders at this level of the company. And so that's another really important point to kind of pull this back to, okay, well, we've got to make this resonate with senior leadership if we want anything to happen. So yes, and is part of the question. The art and the science is to kind of be constantly pulling back to that, who's the customer and what do they really want? And how do we connect the dots between all these things that you want and what they want? Because you're doing the work, perhaps you might be an integral part of this, but somebody, there's a customer paying the bills, and that does tend to override all these local concerns. So the next one, which is a great dovetail to this, what if clear outcome does not emerge from the outcome mapping session? Do you schedule another session, follow up with interviews until you get, and the second part of this is until you get an outcome that is close to a SMART outcome? SMART being specific, measurable, actionable,
relevant and
time bound.
Yeah.
Thank you for the rescue. Yeah. Have you had any experience with this, Andrew? Any kind of tough reconciliation challenges?
I don't think I have had a situation where there wasn't something that was top of mind for folks. I mean, part of the idea is, in the book, we frame that there's two likely scenarios, or broadly simplifying into, there's a mandate or a dictate that you're needing to work towards, or that the outcomes emerge from the discussion with the group. And the very act of the outcome discovery session is one where you start by surfacing a bunch of goals and problems and so forth. So basically, whatever is top of mind for the group will come out now, and implicitly, any and all of those could be, outcomes. I think humans are very, psychologically, we're very action oriented, but what what may happen is that we fail to reach an outcome where either the mandated outcome somehow doesn't resonate with people, or they're not able to understand how they can achieve it, or this doesn't resonate, doesn't seem to be connected. They're not able to use your words, to connect the dots between the local problems and the big strategic problems, or that there's just too many different disparate ideas. So I think not having clarity, not having really simplified and prioritized, is more likely than they're not. I guess that speaks to the clear outcome bit. When you've got lots of outcomes, they can be muddied. So maybe that's me just taking a minute to process the question. But I definitely think that there can be the muddiness in all of that. Or sometimes there's a couple or three outcomes, but they can be in a little bit of tension with each other. And that's a good thing, actually. If there's two outcomes that are a little bit in tension with each other, we have to do this while also being mindful of this other one, right? While not compromising this other concern. But Steve, what's your experience?
Yeah, I think that there's something that comes up, and I've become fairly convinced of, in terms of the mandated outcome, which I think is something that I was alluding to in that previous example, where we had kind of middle management really struggling to kind of align on a target outcome. And I think that part of the challenge there is that middle management is kind of tasked with implementing a mandate or facilitating a mandate, and they don't necessarily have a lot of autonomy in direction or strategy, and sometimes not even tactics. They sometimes they can't even decide what. They don't have the luxury or the autonomy or authority to pick their targets. And so what I've fallen into the trap of prior, and even recently, is the optimistic goal of having them kind of generate a target outcome amongst themselves, and hope that they get to where senior leadership wants them to get to. Senior leadership has a mandate, they have a target. This has been, in all cases, it's been communicated, right? There is a vision, there is a strategy, but I don't think it's enough to cross your fingers as a facilitator and hope that the dots will naturally connect.
Right.
And I've fallen victim to that. I've fallen into that trap, and I failed to facilitate that or navigate that scenario effectively in the past. And so I think it's very important, when there is a mandate, when there is a target, to represent that as our job is to meet this. We've got to get this over the finish line. We have to help this succeed. And our job today in the session is to connect where we are to enabling that, right? To understand how we can connect ourselves in our efforts and our local context to that global optima, the global target. And I think when you leave it up to folks to generate a target or goals or context based on their local conditions, which is going to be their natural frame of reference, you're doing them a disservice. Right? You're sort of allowing them to kind of wander aimlessly, right, and fall into a trap that perhaps it will be very painful in the future to reconcile, because if you let people sort of wander and then you say, hey, just to let you know, you're 2 kilometers off where you need to be, and I'm telling you this now, even though we might have both been counting on moving in the right direction, and that uh, as a facilitator, I was under the assumption that you shared the global target and that you were aware of it, and valued it. Let's say also is very important that you valued it to the same extent that the organization or senior leadership did. Um, that's not really fair. And I've come to realize that that's not really fair and not really ideal. So as much as and this is another reason why I think there's the spectrum of generative to prescriptive is so important to navigate, because if you just allow things to emerge when there is a prescription, right? There is a definition of value already on the table. You're wasting time and you're wasting effort and perhaps goodwill and energy and contribution, and credibility, even if you allow people to kind of wander, and then force them to make up the difference at some point of reconciliation. So I've really moved away from allowing people to kind of generate in cases where generation is not the order of the day. When our job is to actually figure out how can we support the goal that's been set, I think it's very important to kind of get there. And so to this is kind of a wandering way of answering Miguel's question, but I think that in those cases, what's very important is to schedule another session, at least to shrink that distance, right, as quickly and effectively as possible. And usually what I will do, if I find we've run out of time and we haven't got to where we need to go, is I will connect those dots, and then I will say, here's what I came out with. As a facilitator, I have bridged that gap, and I would like you to validate my work, check my math, and if you disagree, let's get it out on record. But another part of the facilitation rules that I commonly adhere to is disagree and commit. Right? We can have different opinions. The organization is not about opinions; it's about achieving target outcomes. Right? So. That's another thing that I think is really important to set early on, so that you have the ability to forge ahead, right? Move and make progress, even in the face of differences of opinion and disagreement. Last question, and this one's a great one to finish off with. What resources do you recommend for someone looking to improve the workshop facilitation and interviewing side of flow engineering? And the second half is, or is it mostly a matter of learning from practice? So I was thinking about this, and I posted in the thread, but I'll just repeat really quickly. I think the first thing that came to mind was, Squirrel and Frederick's Agile Conversations, I think, is a great way to practice active listening, which I think is a very powerful technique that I think of when I think about facilitation. And then I think there's a lot of folks who really invest deeply in facilitating workshops. And I forget who runs it, but a site that came to mind, workshops.work, I think, kind of focuses in this space and runs a podcast, which I've enjoyed in the past. So let me see if I can pull that up, and I can maybe post it in the chat. Andrew, anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, the resource that's been most helpful for me has been the Liberating Structures community. They run a ton of meetups around liberating structures, and we intentionally chose to frame each of the 5 flow engineering mapping exercises as liberating structures. So, the more you get familiar with liberating structures, the more you can translate that knowledge over into flow engineering. But liberating structures organizes around these microstructures that might be as short as like 5 minute long, but it's a structured interactive interaction game. Sometimes they're called structured interactive exercise that is designed to draw out the independent thinking of all participants, have that emergent effect, but it's still structured, still guiding in particular directions. So there's a lot of good resources. The more familiarity you get with that, the more comfort you will have with the general process of facilitation, in the sense of putting forward clear questions or statements, setting a timer, giving space, organizing groups, and so forth, and letting the process play out while giving it nudges periodically to bring it back together. The other resource that came to mind is a book that I've bought but I've not yet read, called The Workshop Survival Guide. I looked it up here to remind myself. Rob Fitzpatrick and Devin Hunt wrote The Workshop Survival Guide. I forget who recommended it. I forget when it was recommended to me, but it was recommended strongly enough that I bought it, but have not yet read it. So that's my
fair. That's great. I think the other, just to call them out specifically, we mentioned them a couple times over the course of the session, but time boxing, incredibly powerful. Setting clear goals for each of those time boxes, right? And being very clear about communicating that. The job for the next 5 minutes is to get to this, right? We have to, by any means necessary, we need to work together to get to this. I think I'm always surprised by what you're able to achieve when you count on people being smart and resourceful. And, sometimes I'm amazed by just doing that, the initial framing and setting of targets and giving people the boundary, and then say, go do this, work amongst yourselves. You're a team, or you're a group of colleagues who may go from a group of strangers to being more like a team by solving this challenge. And then we'll do the next one, and we'll do the next one, and we'll get through a whole session by breaking it down into these little vignettes, these little pieces. And I think that goes a long way to not only fostering a sense of engagement, and we want to be in that flow state, even in a workshop, right? Where the challenge and skill match is in that sweet spot. I did that backwards. I think that's really valuable. And so I think that you could surprise yourself by tasking people with specific instructions, goals, boundaries, and allowing them to operate, however they can best contribute. And we love working in teams, right? I mean, it's very fulfilling, especially a new team. We forge friendships and relationships that way. And it can be very exciting. So I think that not being the single bottleneck, the single participant on the board is really powerful. So
also, the skill is not just on you as a facilitator. The skill is also on the participants. So if the participants are already, verbal, engaged, comfortable in their own skin, it'll be easier for you to facilitate an amazing workshop. If you have a group of people who are pretty shy, shut down, nonverbal, and so forth, it's going to take a while for them to get the hang of things. And that's where, I really feel like Liberating Structures has a lot of techniques to help draw people out gradually, because that's a long-term thing. You can't put all of the responsibility on yourself as a facilitator.
Yeah, well said. All right, Andrew. Thank you, Miguel, again for throwing us questions. You in the audience, if you're watching this, throw us questions on the next session. We'd love to talk about what you're most interested in. So hopefully we checked all the boxes for Miguel. We'd love to hear from you and hear your feedback. And from everybody else watching, subscribe to the next one. Jump on the next session. We'll throw a link to it in the comments, and we'll see you there.
Thanks.